Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorjan, and I'm here as always with Paul. And Paul, despite the fact that there was a good meeting about a week ago between Trump and Putin over what was going on in Ukraine, Foreign Minister Lavrov pretty much put his foot down in a recent statement saying the Ukraine war will only end on Russia's terms. Paul, as always, I want to thank you for being a part of this discussion. And perhaps we should do a review of what all the parameters of the Russian SMO in Ukraine are all about.
Yeah, well, first off, thanks for joining as well, Ken. Yeah, this is an important discussion because a lot of it is there's assumptions, and some of the assumptions are reasonable, some of them aren't, some of them lack clarity. And remember, this is, as you rightly said, Ken, and this nails the point on the head. Russia says unless all our SMO objectives have been realized. Now, there's two ways that happens. Hopefully not through an ongoing war, but the risk is that could happen because Russia's demands, the United States is going to find unacceptable and to varying degrees. And we're going to go through each point and go, well, does the US care about this or don't they? Or for that matter, trying to enforce it might be problematic as well. But also it's all kind of relates to the fact as well when we assess what these conditions are with regards to what the whole list of them is, what is the Ukrainian response to this going to be? Is Europe going to start refusing to accept it also? That goes back to the point of, does the war carry on? Because even though Russia and the United States have reached an agreement, Ukraine goes, we're not going to agree to it. Okay, it's very easy to cut them off. But then if Europe insists on continuing to arm Ukraine, then NATO is going to be effectively not directly at war, but kind of at war with each other. Because and it'll cause a gigantic schism and rip the NATO alliance apart, even though it's very fractured already. So let's go through all the various points and also there is going to be problems with the interpretation of this in some cases, which will add a lot of confusion to trying to integrate all these points into an agreement that both sides are happy with. Well, okay, one of the things that was the whole point before the war started in December 2021, when the Russians wrote this document, said, we things like neutrality, etc. But also it related to regions in Donbass, so basically Donetsk and Lugansk. And the idea was, well, they have independence, as was supposed to have been agreed at the time of Minsk, or Minsk II, and of course that fell apart as well. But it's worth noting because whilst we don't discuss operational things with respect to Ukraine, it's worth noting that Russia currently, in terms of Donetsk, only probably controls 78% of it. Well, so the rest of that will have to be effectively become part of Russia. It's going to have to be liberated from a Russian perspective. Well, what does that mean for all the Ukrainian forces? How are you going to tell the Ukrainian forces to leave? I mean, because they might not do. I mean, and okay, I don't think the United States themselves is going to have a problem with that. Lugansk is a non-issue because Russia controls basically 99.8% of it. So it's a non-issue. That's not going to be a problem in getting Ukrainians to leave. Now, this is on the basis, remember, of course, that the agreement satisfies all the criteria that Russia applies to, because the argument from Lavrov is if you don't, the war continues. Then you've got Kherson, which was subsequently added. They had a referendum there. that was added to the list of SMO requirements. Because remember, they kept saying to the West and Ukraine, well, this is what we'll agree to now to end the war. And then they started adding extra bits saying, well, that deadline's gone. There's a new terms we're going to apply to what our agreement is. Kherson probably and Zaporozhye, Russia controls about the same percentage as Donetsk. So then you've got the same issues there. Now, what does the United States' perception of this? I don't think the US is particularly bothered about Russia controlling those regions or those regions becoming integrated into the Russian Federation as far as the West is concerned. But here's a problem. You're going to also have to get the Ukrainians to agree to this, because if they don't, in 5 years or whenever, 10 years, who knows, the Ukrainians might turn around and go, we never signed up to that. We never agreed to those regions being part of Russia. So we think there's a scope for contesting those, and who knows what the outcome will be. So they also have to get the Ukrainians to sign up and agree to this. Well, what happens if the Ukrainians refuse? It's not like you can force them to do so. It's not possible. So that's also another problem with those. And they're the very core, obvious regions to start with that, you'd think it was very simple, but it's not simple. And then the problem is, if you make these statements, what's Europe's response to this going to be? And is Europe then going to go, this is wholly unacceptable, because they've, as we said previously, they've got this political stance, etc., and that they have to keep the war going in, because if they look like that Russia's taking those regions, that looks bad on them politically. So everyone has to contend with the wild card of European countries. Now, the argument is most of them will fold once the agreement's reached, but Germany, France, and probably Britain might not do. But what are they going to do with regards to refusing to implement this agreement? Well, then it becomes whether potentially at risk of a conflict with the Russians, and also a conflict in a very different sense with the Americans. So I'll stop there because it's a good point for you to come in, Ken. But that just shows the complexity of the four most obvious regions that everyone assumed, well, what needs to be discussed? There is no problem. Well, there clearly are problems.
And inevitably, Russia, just take a look at the past. They had an agreement, Minsk agreement, that was broken, shattered, primarily by Europe, but also by the United States. Trust, you can have as much trust in Trump and his administration and his advisors as you can, but Russia also realizes that once Donald Trump is gone, then what is the United States going to do? The same thing with Europe. What's Europe going to do? We've already long talked about the fact that the last thing Russia wants to do is to try to have to seize and control and govern the entirety of Ukraine. Because it's one thing having ethnic Russians that have a loyalty to your country. It's another thing trying to govern, it'd be the equivalent of the Taliban under US occupation. You never know when they're going to rebel against you or cause strife or cause havoc. And it's just much more of a pain in the butt to try to deal with it than it is, to control, to willingly have, like in Crimea, where the people voted to be part of the Russian Federation and thus can be developed, etc. And, I was thinking that we have this one interesting point of a lot of, Transnistria. And you could almost consider what remains of Ukraine when all is said and done, after Russia accomplishes what it wants, is that the western part of Ukraine that is going to want to have ties to Europe, it's going to be, the western part and southern part is going to be like a form of Transnistria. And hopefully, you would think if Europe gets off its hatred of Russia and instead looks at it as, you know what, we could use Ukraine as a portal, the same way Turkey uses the Bosphorus as a portal to the West. And I think that would be significant. Of course, that's going to be probably decades, down the line before those who have the hatred in Europe, pass on or get out of power, et cetera, and the people look at things differently. But honestly, when you take a look at the facts and the evidence, Russia has wanted for a long time to be partners with Europe, and Europe in many ways has stabbed them in the back. Now Russia is going to have to go through, finish their SMO, and then have to deal with a Europe, and even in part still a United States that is untrustworthy. And how much can you trust them to follow through with what they do? Well, if Europe finally releases the frozen assets and works together to rebuild and open up the Nord Stream pipeline and does things that actually prove trust, well, then you can start seeing a cooperation between the two. But until then, as long as you have this hatred and this mindset amongst European leaders, which is for the most part probably not the mindset of the people themselves, then even when the ceasefire and the final reckoning comes to Ukraine and the end of the SMO, it's going to be one of those tentative things like from 2014 to 2022.
Well, yes, and that has to be avoided at all costs. I mean, and that's problematic. So, yeah, that's another aspect. And the Russians are adamant there's no ceasefire. This war ends. The second, it's like once we've got an agreement and it's watertight, the second all sides have signed, we drop arms and end hostilities. And until then, even if you sign it at 11 a.m., to coin a phrase from World War One, at 10:59, it's still war. And that's the point the West is also not grasping. But coming back to regions, just a couple of other obvious points. Of course, the Ukrainians thought they could use Kursk as this bargaining chip because we're controlling Kursk, which of course they never did. And then you can have Kursk back if you give us Donbass back, which of course is nonsense. Now, Russia effectively now controls 97%. So that's never was a bargaining chip. And it's not something that's going to even become a statement for the Americans to make. Crimea is the same problem because Ukraine has to recognize that, along with the aforementioned four regions, as being part of Russia. They refuse to do so. If they refuse in the future, then an agreement becomes a major problem. And if they don't, the war continues. The other point worth making is Russia's making inroads into not Odessa and Nikolaev, but certainly Sumy and Kharkov. Now, the question therefore is, and we're not going to try and speculate on that, but why is Russia there? Why are they doing this? Is that because they intend to say, well, we want Kharkov to be part of this, we want Sumy? Nikolaev and Odessa might be a bridge too far. There'd have to be a heck of a horse trading with the American for the US to agree that Ukraine is landlocked and has no access to the Black Sea. I just don't think that's going to happen. And I don't think Russia, even though there are logical historical reasons for particularly like Odessa, but I just don't think that's necessarily, even for the Russians, part of what they regard as being an agreement in the future. So I think that sort of deals with all the territorial things. Then you come on to the issue of, and this is where we'll do this point by point, demilitarization of Ukraine. What does that even mean? I mean, as far as Russia's concerned, the goal has not been achieved. But what does it mean? What do the Russians think it means? What do the NATO countries, the Europeans think? What do the Americans think? I mean, you can't literally say you can't have any guns at all to protect your country, but presumably this relates to heavy weapons. What does that even mean? What are heavy weapons can you define as being a problem? Is it anything that can be fired that could land in Russian territory, for example? So that's a really, really difficult, problematic issue. The neutral status of Ukraine, I don't think is a problem. Not joining NATO, well, that's not going to be a problem. It might be for Ukraine, but it's not Ukraine's decision. But how's that written down? So in a few years they go, well, we've decided that no longer applies because Trump's not in office and the world's changed, because that goal's not being achieved either at this point in time. Then there's the very thorny subject. What does Russia mean about denazification? And it's not for us to attempt to understand what they mean by that. How is that going to be part of any future agreement? Because Russia says that goal's not being achieved. How do you determine when that goal has been achieved? And if they are that adamant, which they seem to be, then if there's not an agreement reached on that, then the war continues. And, frankly, that's just a very, very difficult, thorny subject because do you apply it to individuals? I mean, we're not going to get into what that means because, frankly, it's pointless, but it is a huge problem and it's a big stumbling block in terms of what that might mean to getting an agreement. And based on Russia's very dogmatic stance about, because they've said that from day one of this SMO. So there are a few more problems that Russia has to deal with. And also the Europeans or NATO countries, the United States, in determining an agreement.
To me, that's one of the most significant things about this conflict is that Russia, from the very start, had their mission goals laid out. They knew exactly what they wanted to do. Everything that both the U.S. and Europe has tried to do to counter this on the side of the proxy has been reactionary. Oh, we'll just throw more sanctions on there. Oh, we'll see about stealing their frozen assets. Oh, we'll do this, but we'll do stronger missiles and we'll do F-16s. They're doing everything piecemeal, and they're not recognizing the fact that they don't themselves have a goal to bring about the end of the conflict. You take a look at something that Peskov said. The Europeans continue on the path of sanctions nosedive, on the path of conviction in the need to continue the war. That's not a goal. That's simply just to keep the status quo with no end in sight. Even Europe doesn't know what is going to happen at the end of the conflict. And I think more than anything, they're going to have to, in the aftermath, take a look at how much they have lost and have to answer to their people, what exactly this big waste of engendering themselves to Ukraine has brought about.
Yeah, absolutely. And this also comes on to the point you rightly make the point about the lifting of sanctions on Russia. Now, from Russia, from a literal sense, it makes no difference. They don't care. But it's going to have to be something that's part of the agreement. Otherwise, the sanctions will stay in perpetuity. I mean, I know the Americans have said once the agreement's in play, they'll lift sanctions, but does that mean Europe will? Because at the end of the day, Europe might be still making these dogmatic have this dogmatic viewpoint and implement dogmatic position, which ultimately is going to be disastrous economically and financially for the Western countries and European countries. I mean, the United States can lift sanctions, they can open SWIFT, but the European banks go, you're not having your money, then what happens? So sanctions are not important in one sense, they are in another. Another point that might seem trivial, but isn't, they want statements about no more harassment and bad treatment of Russians and Russian speakers in Ukraine. Well, how's that going to be implemented? I mean, to what extent is that a deal breaker? I mean, because if it carries on after the war's over and Russia says, well, I'm sorry, you're maltreating Russians and Russian speakers, you're in breach, because the argument must be if you're in breach of this agreement, either side, then it's tantamount to a declaration of war again. So, sounds a trivial point. It's not a trivial point. It's a really difficult thing to assess, to actually implement. And they all seem like trivial points, and they're not trivial. And this all has to hang together in an agreement, because again, if it doesn't, you have no agreement, the war carries on. The problem is, if the war carries on, what does that mean as well? What, Russia just keeps going and going and taking more and more territory? And in the end, what happens if they, I'm saying hypothetically, this is a thought experiment, the war carries on and on and on, they take the whole of Ukraine, then what? What happens? Because Russia doesn't want the whole of the country. What they're going to say, let's have an agreement. And then, even though they control the whole country, the agreement's no, I'm not accepting those terms. I mean, and then they'll go, most of nations involved by that point won't want anything to do with it anymore, because then the problem also is if Russia doesn't control it and there's a huge rebuilding exercise that's going to cost trillions of euros, projected to be 3 trillion over a decade. Who's paying for that? So again, these are just things that seem to be trivial, but they're not trivial, and they just massively complicate how you reach a resolution.
No, very much agreed. And it's, it almost in many ways reminds me of the fall of the Berlin Wall, because that took place before the actual complete fall of the Soviet Union and the breakdown of the Cold War. So when that started taking place, you did have a few years of, okay, we have East Germany, East Germans now who have been indoctrinated with Soviet thoughts for so long. How are they going to integrate into Germany? And it's kind of fascinating, up to using this analogy, is because the most recent elections, AfD got their biggest base of support from East Germany, because those individuals remembered what it was like being under the old Soviet Union, and they didn't want to do that again. And so they wanted liberty and freedom. Now, I digress just a touch, but what I'm saying is that Europe and Ukraine and this hatred of Russia that they've pushed and fomented for so long, it's not going to change overnight. And there is, as you mentioned, there is the great potential for schisms, incidents, and et cetera to take place. So I think, when Russia is done, the peace agreement is finally signed. I think Russia is going to have to be, at least on their guard for probably 5, 10, 20 years, knowing that, if something comes up, they're going to have to measure just how big it is. Is it something that's just a small little skirmish between two little neighborhoods that hate each other, or is it something that is being pushed, covertly to try to create chaos and keep this type of animosity going?
Yeah, absolutely. You can extend that further. What's the risk of bogus false flags happening in Ukraine going, it's the Russians, they've breached the agreement, this is a declaration of war again, I mean, okay, you can take this to the nth degree and tie yourself in knots, but that's a possibility. And then, while the war's ongoing, and it's still ongoing, then what happens with regards to Russia's expansion of territorial control? Because in a month or two, they could control most of Dnipro because there's no real defense there. And they'll keep going because they're nearly at Dnipro. So does that change? I mean, where do you draw the line with this agreement? Does it say, well, it doesn't include Dnipro, and Russia's going to go, well, we're not, what's no point going any further? But if they're halfway in there, they're going to go, well, no, Dnipro is part of this, potentially. which the United States is going to be happy about because, okay, we don't know what the mineral wealth is in reality. It's being grossly exaggerated, but you get the point. So this territorial requirements as part of this agreement keep changing. Okay, it's not like they're going to take it. They already think they've got Donetsk. It doesn't matter, but it's not about Donetsk per se. I mean, and the problem is not most of these goals, nothing's being realized. So it's kind of in limbo. So we're back to, is it going to be finished via hostilities or diplomatic agreement? We have to hope it's diplomatic agreements. So all these parameters, all these things are going to have to be discussed in negotiations with the United States. So what we're trying to basically say is this is not only a very difficult task, but also it's got moving goalposts. Things are changing all the time because it's a fluid war. It's not like, it's a situation where, well, the outcome's always being Russia will take the whole country. So these ongoing wars don't really matter. They do matter. And then the problem is what happens in a post-war environment? Who's going to be responsible for rebuilding what? I mean, the Europeans are going to demand Russia pays for it, or Russia's going to go, no, because we won the war. It's a bit like, who paid to rebuild Germany, at the end of the war. I mean, and, I hate to say use the word because no one wins wars, but the spoils go to the victor. Well, in reality, Russia's the victor. So, what happens in this regard? So by doing this podcast, it just eloquently highlights the myriad of problems that is going to be faced and why there is so many moving parts to this that constantly keep changing on a day-to-day basis, and how you enforce some very kind of spurious comments in principle. They're very woolly. There's no real definition to them. And if ending the war depends on resolving them, how is that going to be resolved?
Nothing. We don't have to dwell on this, but another monkey wrench in this, of course, is where Starmer and the UK signed a 100-year agreement with the Kiev government to provide even military support. So how is that going to affect the future in regards to when Russia gets its demands and then has to deal with a Ukraine that now has one of its ancient enemies in the UK being tied directly on their border? Something to talk about on a different day. Anyway, I think we covered everything. Was there anything you wanted to add, Paul?
I think that's a good point to stop. But just to emphasize your point about this deal with the UK, absolutely, it's another huge problem.
Yeah, so we just don't know. Maybe that's going to be a demand at the table that Russia, that has to be broken. Period. So we shall see. Anyway, Paul, as always, thank you for your time and for your insight.
Yes, and likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you for all of your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.